Hello, it's Todd Lewis, your host of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm tonight joined by Craig to debate apostolic succession and the papacy. So thank you for joining me tonight, Craig.
Thanks for having me on, Todd. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so we'll begin with you giving the sort of positive case for it.
Yeah, so apostolic succession from a Catholic point of view goes all the way back to the scriptures itself. And we see very clearly in the scriptures that we have the 12 and we have Peter with a particular role within that 12, and that the ministry of the 12 and the ministry of Peter was handed on to successors. We see that in scripture. That apostolic succession, that ministry of the 12 and the apostolic and the ministry of Peter was handed on to successors, and we see this play itself out in the very early tradition of the church with St. Paul himself in the Book of Acts. We see it with Peter in the Book of Acts. We see it with Clement of Rome in around 80 AD. Ignatius of Antioch around 110 AD. And we especially see it when we get a little further into the patristic era with Irenaeus of Lyon and Hippolytus of Rome, that we have a full-blown sense of apostolic succession by 200 AD in the church. This was something that was established incredibly early on, and we see the seeds of it in Scripture itself. So I think that's a pretty good starting point.
Okay, good. So right now, let's first talk about, you mentioned Irenaeus and his definition of apostolic succession, and then also I want to mention Tertullian, and maybe sort of for a ground platform, I want to read from Book 3, Chapter 3, Paragraph 1 of Against Heresies, where Irenaeus gives a more full-blown concept of it.
Sure.
For if the apostles had known hidden mysteries which they were in the habit of imparting to the perfect and privily from the rest, they would have delivered them especially to those to whom they were committed to the church themselves. For they were desirous that these men should be very perfect and blameless in all things, whom also they were leaving behind as their successors, delivering up their own place of government to those men, which men, if they discharged their function honestly, would be a great boon to the church, but if they should fall away, the direst calamity. This is from part of the same paragraph or the same section. It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world, and we are in possession to reckon up these who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate succession of these men to our own times, those who neither taught nor knew anything like what these heretics rave about. And the other point, now that's I think the most complete early definition is in you can find it in Tertullian. It's in his Against Marcion, and I have it here. I just need the exact. Yeah, okay. Prescription against the heretics. There we go. Okay, it's in that work. And he says, and this is important because we've already got the chain of apostolic succession laid down with Irenaeus, and of course Tertullian reaffirms that. But there's an interesting aspect that he adds as he fleshes it out. He says, in exactly the same way the other churches likewise exhibited, whom, as I have been appointed to their episcopal places by apostles, they regarded as transmitters of the apostolic seed. Let the heretics contrive something of the same kind. For after their blasphemy, which is that unlawful for them to attempt, but should they even effect the contrivance, they would not advance a step. For their very doctrine, after comparison with that of the apostles, will declare by its own diversity and contrariety that it had been for its author neither an apostle nor an apostolic man, because as the apostles would never have taught things which were self-contradictory, so the apostles would never have inculcated teachings different from the apostles unless they were received the instruction from the apostles, went and preached in the contrary manner. And he also says later on that there are other churches that lack apostolic succession in the genealogical sense, but are nonetheless in apostolic succession in the sense that they have apostolic teaching. Now, the point that is to contest whether a church has apostolic succession, in part, can be determined by the rule of faith. And Irenaeus and Tertullian both give rules of faith, and the rule of faith in each case, and even earlier, is that they teach nothing other than what the apostles taught. And I think you can agree that that would be. And this quotation, which about the rule, it implies the rule of faith, comes from the Catholic Encyclopedia, New Advent, where they discuss the magisterium and tradition.
Sure.
To this identity of revealed truth corresponds the identity of faith. What the first Christians believe, we still believe, and what we believe today, they believe more or less explicitly in a more or less conscious way. So, does that description of apostolic succession, as far as going to the primary sources and some clarification, give us at least an agreed upon common ground to begin working from?
Sure. That's I have no issue with either of the quotations that you read.
Okay, so the point that I am going to attempt to demonstrate is that the Roman Catholic Church, well, it's not just the Roman Catholic Church, but that in the 4th century, the rule of faith there was no Orthodox or Catholic Church at the time. It was just one church. It only split in 1054. But that church explicitly broke away from the rule of faith. And there's a couple ways I could attempt to demonstrate this. And the way that I'm going to do it is by focusing on one of the key teachings of early Christianity that, hold on a second, on war and peace. Now, most people probably don't know this, but there is no extant Christian writing prior to the 4th century that allows Christians to either hold a military service, swear oaths, serve in the government, the Roman government. No, volunteer to serve, right? I mean, if you're converted as a legionnaire, well then, tough noogies, you can't just leave because the Romans are going to kill you. But the expectation was that you couldn't leave at all. And the apostolic tradition by Hippolytus states, well, as I look it up, basically states that if somebody joins the army, they've abandoned the faith. And so what I would say is that was a key tenet of, next execution, a document called the Apostolic Tradition. And that rule of faith was broken. Now, I think the first objection is you might contest the claim that prior to the 4th century, that was the rule of faith. Would that be your first contest?
Well, the rule of faith prior to the Council of Nicaea was certainly fluid, and the notion of rule of faith was universally accepted. What that rule of faith consisted of differed in various places. There had not been a Council of Nicaea for everyone to get together and decide on a Nicene Creed, which definitively decides the rule of faith at the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople. So after that, there is a rule of faith. You can have another rule of faith somewhere else, but it has to adhere and conform to the Nicene and the Constantinopolitan Creed. Excuse me.
So okay, go ahead.
So once you have that first that ecumenical council, differing rules of faith go by the wayside and become of lesser authority. And so I think a firm starting point would be, if we're going to talk about a rule of faith, that it would have to be the Nicene Creed.
So when you say there was diversity, you mean that without the top-down imposition, that there were differing teachings. Now, in some areas, for instance, the celebration of Easter, or the that's one good example.
Yeah.
Throughout the Christian churches within the Roman Empire, there was diversity, but again, are you saying that there could be no diversity ipso post, there could be no uniform rule of faith ipso post facto because there was no council, or that there could be, but it's unlikely because without the authority of the council to legitimate and enforce that rule of faith, it would be highly unlikely to coalesce.
Well, I think prior to the Council of Nicaea, there just wasn't a common, the Christian church just had not come together and made decisions about. There were, the church was young. There were persecutions. It was separated by, vast spans of time and space, and so it wasn't until Constantine brought everyone together and said, work out some of these disagreements, that that we can really talk about a rule of faith that can be pointed to definitively. Now, the idea of a rule of faith, Clement of Rome in his letter to the Corinthians is talking about a rule of faith, that there is this thing, this objective standard of doctrine that they have to adhere to. But that the formulations of those rules of faith differed from place to place.
Well, again, are you saying that there were some differences, but of course, in some cases there was uniformity, right? Through all the Christian churches,
sure,
there was a uniform notion that Christ was born of a virgin, Christ was crucified by Pilate, Christ was the Son of God. Amongst the Orthodox Christian churches, small o before the schism, you could argue that was the uniform rule of faith, correct?
Well, yes, but I think that's us imposing uniformity on it after the fact. When you look at, the historical context in 80 AD, mm-hmm. There was a rule of faith in Rome, and then mm-hmm. when you went to Antioch, that rule of faith might have been slightly different. Certainly, it was centered on the risen Christ, and certainly, the Holy Spirit and God the Father, and those elements were all of the elements of what we have in the Nicene Creed today were there early on. All of those pieces, like you had the bricks, but you did not have a brick wall that you could call a rule of faith. That you had this concept of a rule of faith, and there were differing, slight differences. I wouldn't say that there were fundamental differences, but a singular rule of faith that could be pointed to had not been hashed out yet.
Okay, that's part of the contention here. Now, as far as the rule of faith being diverse, so for example, but see, do you mean diversity in content or application? So, for instance, baptism might be applied differently depending on where in the Roman Empire you were. So, the application of the baptism might vary from area to area. But again, the idea of a baptism was the universal rule of faith of the Christian churches.
Sure, and I think an example of the kind of diversity that I'm talking about is the passage that you cited from Tertullian, where he's talking about military service is a violation of the rule of faith. And it's like, well, you've got Roman soldiers becoming Christians in the scriptures. It's like, well, that can't be absolute. I mean, that at that time that may have been problematic for Christians, and that's certainly not a part of the essential rule of faith today. You certainly have people in the military that are Christians, and that's then there's certainly an argument to be made about is it the pacifism and just war and all of that. All of that aside, there an absolute stricture on military service, I think, would have been a non-essential part of a rule of faith.
Okay, yeah. That's the contention that is really here, because now I don't know how much you want me to spend time to demonstrate it, but that is absolutely not the case. In the first 3 centuries of the church, there is no church father anywhere or council anywhere that would make that a negotiable part of the rule of faith.
That you're saying that all of the early church fathers, from Clement of Rome to, how far do you want to go?
Up to Lactantius, but of course he changes after Constantine. Of course, he tutors Constantine's children. But right before the Milvian Bridge incident, he has he changes his mind, and I'm going to get into that, why he does that later. But yeah, okay. That's complete non-negotiable. I mean, there's praxis, and then there's theology. So there's certain practices that a Christian must perform, otherwise that person forfeits their Christianity.
Sure.
Or if they do or don't do, right? Now that's not at the same level as doctrine, like what you believe about God.
Right.
But of course, it's enough to get you booted out of the church if you cross those lines, right?
Yeah. Well, and that would be, when you're talking about a rule of faith, you're typically talking about formulations of doctrine, primarily.
Mm-hmm.
Formulations you get into a notion of a rule of life that would be based on the rule of faith, and you see this fleshed out with the Desert Fathers pretty specifically. But I'm if there are church fathers including military service, if you're violating the rule of faith by participating in the military by itself, that's not a line of thinking in the patristic fathers that I'm aware of.
Okay, yeah. This is from the Apostolic tradition by Hippolytus, because this is the application of the doctrine.
Sure.
I think this is paragraph 16, line 11. Looks like the catechumen are faithful who wants to become a soldier is to be rejected, for he has despised God. Now, that is not even really a synod. It's just the apostolic tradition. But as far as actual in contemporary sources that have studied this work, we have Ronald Sider, he wrote the Early Church on Killing, a comprehensive source book on war, abortion, capital punishment. And Sider says, first up until the time of Constantine, there's not a single Christian writer known to us who says that it is legitimate for a Christian to kill or to join the military. And then, actually, that was the only guy I have up. There's another guy, Calansis, who wrote another book which studies the same topic, which gives a similar conclusion as to the nature of the early Christian teachings. And it's some of these teachings by church fathers are exceedingly clear that that would be a forfeiture of your Christian commitment. Would you want me to read some? And not just from a certain area. I want to demonstrate that it's a empire-wide and centuries consistent position, right? Because you can always say, well, it's just this little area here, that little area here, at that time in this place. But if it's all throughout the empire for a consistent 300-year period, that gives us a fairly, and when there's no countervailing voice of any kind, that's pretty much the best kind of evidence you can get for a kind of application of the rule of faith as a kind of praxis.
Sure. You had, in a given church, you would have had presbyters, elders, deacons, with the apostolic tradition document. There's an incredible amount of detail on worship, liturgy, practice. I mean, it's one of the most detailed documents in the early church about some of those things, particularly about the church in Rome. Now, it's fairly well known that up to the time of Constantine, you had intensive persecutions going on against Christians, and those persecutions were being carried out by the military. So, anyone who was aspiring to, military service, that would have been, akin to Ananias's hesitation about Saul when God told him to go, to him. It's like, this guy's been persecuting me. Why would I want to go to him? So there's that kind of political situation going on that was precipitating that kind of rule of faith for those, especially up to 312, before you have Constantine lifting the strictures on Christianity. And then it was military service was no longer a problem for Christians because, overnight the entire empire essentially became Christian in some sense. And so
to clarify real quick, you're saying that the reason why the church fathers would have said what they said then was because they didn't want to identify with the main tip of the spear, as it were, of imperial repression.
Well, it would have been incredibly dangerous and perhaps foolish that if you have a military that is actively trying to destroy you, and you have a catechumen like you had, you cited from the, if you have a catechumen that is actively trying to be a part of a group that is trying to destroy the church, well, of course the church is not going to allow them to become a catechumen. That's just common sense. But in terms of that having to do with a rule, I would say that you're talking about sort of admission requirements for the church. Of course, you're not going to let someone who is aspiring to be a part of, this organization that's trying to persecute the church. That to me just seems like common sense.
Well, yes, but the stricture, I mean, again, I read to you from the Apostolic tradition, but the stricture wasn't just against destroying the Roman legion. The stricture was against, any kind of manslaughter that you could think of, as well as the swearing of oaths. And none of it was motivated. See, right, we don't want to psychoanalyze people from the past because we don't know what they were thinking unless they wrote it down. And even then, they might be lying to us. But generally speaking, when we read ancient texts, we assume that they're largely faithful unless there's reason to doubt that they're otherwise. And none of the arguments are they're really from one source. It's an extrapolation on the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. They'll appeal to Old Testament prophecy as well, Micah 2:4 Isaiah 2:4 and Micah 4:2, among others. But they primarily appeal to that. And the resistance against a Roman soldier was not because they were a Roman soldier per se. It was a broader rejection of which the Roman soldier fell into.
Well, sure, and the agenda of the empire at that point was to eliminate, in most cases, with many of the emperors for the first 300 years, it was to eliminate Christianity.
No, sure, but the point is, though, it wasn't. Well, if they're only afraid of having soldiers, Roman soldiers, then they could raise their own private forces like the Sicarii, but they didn't pursue that strategy either.
Sure. So I just want to make the final point, then I'll let you go. But if it hadn't been a universal, rather, if it had been only a particular prohibition against the Roman legionnaire, then one would have expected an openness to sort of like essentially the resistance you find in first century Palestine, the zealots. But no such activities are, in fact, not only no such activities pursued, but the reasons are given why they're not. And it's the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. I'm sorry, go ahead. Sure. Well, and just in terms of just to kind of back up to the broader theme of apostolic succession, what sort of where are we at this stage of the game? I mean, we're talking about rule of faith, and that obviously plays a role in apostolic succession. And I mean, the presence of apostolic succession from the time of Paul to the time of Augustine, are you arguing against that, the presence of apostolic succession, or because I would say, well, I don't think that argues against the reality of apostolic succession that's there in the entire early church. I mean, it's there.
No, I'm not arguing against the existence of the succession, but I'm going to read you again from Irenaeus. He said that, where do I want to start here? For they are desirous that these men should be perfect and blameless in all things, whom also they have leaving behind as their successors, delivering up their own place of government, which if they had discharged their functions, that's the wrong part, if they had secret knowledge. Yes, here we go. And we are in the position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, up to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times, those who neither taught nor knew anything like the ravings of the heretic. And then Tertullian, in his own, against the heretics, makes a similar claim. We don't teach anything that was unknown to the apostles. And of course, that's in fact the quote from New Advent that I read. They said that we don't teach anything unknown from the apostles, and it was either there explicitly or implicitly.
Yeah.
Now this gets into the distinction between the seed that grows, so you have a kernel, and then there's a range of possible interpretations of things that as the succession grows, then they're fleshed out.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in the fleshing out process, you can't directly contradict what was uniformly taught and believed by the church in the beginning. It has to be. It can't be a contradiction of it. It has to be a explanation of it.
An
right?
explanation of it, or a further elaboration.
Clarification, elaboration. Exactly.
Sure.
Now, if in that process you teach something that directly contradicts it, then of course you can't be in that line of succession then, right? If in the process of clarifying and expanding, you directly contradict what was said earlier, well, then you can't be a part of that tradition anymore because you've left it yourself, correct?
That would be correct.
Yes, that is the angle that I'm going at here, that the Catholic Church does teach explicitly contradictory to what was universally taught by the apostles in the early church. And that's how it lacks apostolic succession. So maybe that makes it clear the angle that I'm taking.
Okay. So the lack of because
I think I may not have been clear enough up front, like how I was trying to attack. I wasn't attacking the idea of apostolic succession itself. I was merely attacking Rome's claim to have it.
Okay.
And you seem to think that might have been the other case. So I wanted to get that cleared out of the way.
Okay. Good.
And that's why I'm taking this particular attack, because if this can be demonstrated to be an apostolic teaching and a teaching held throughout the church for 3 centuries, and then in the name of clarifying and expanding interpretation, the Catholic Church taught something diametrically. I mean, there's no doubt that it's the exact opposite teaching. Right? It's not just a fuzzy area. Right. If in fact in the Council of Arles, I think it was 314, quite the opposite was said. If you leave the army, then you're to be excommunicated. So this is like, A does not equal not A. It's like, it's totally different statements.
Right. Well, I would argue that the situation that Tertullian is talking about concerning military service and the situation that you cited, I mean, the distinction between dogma and discipline is that you're not talking about theology per se. You're talking about an aspect of praxis that can change, and I think that the circumstances, regarding military service, as we've been discussing, changed dramatically. Like it became conscionable, to be a Christian and be in the military at the same time. Whereas prior to Constantine, I don't think that was I would agree with, the stricture against, admitting someone who was, an aspiring Roman soldier. That would be a conflict of interest, to say the least.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a matter of discipline, and you're not, when you're talking about, when you're talking about the rule of faith, you're really talking about, when you, God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, and the nature of the church. I mean, those are the 4 main elements that you see in all creedal statements from the earliest times up to the Nicene Creed. They were these formulations of what you had to believe about God, and you had worship that expressed that.
Yeah. Okay. A couple points here. One, yes, it is a praxis issue, but that itself doesn't really matter, because the Donatists, as Augustine freely admitted, in all areas of theology, were in complete agreement with the Catholic Church. But in the one area of praxis, church discipline, of the principle of ex operato, they rejected and hence were excommunicated, and the Roman state was then marshaled to put them down. So clearly, that's enough for the Catholic Church to boot somebody out of apostolic. I mean, obviously, the Donatists are not assumed to have the rule of faith, even though the only violation that they are admitted to have had was with ex operato.
Yeah, and they were.
But the last thing is, if that can knock the Donatists out, then what I'm saying is, from the prior position, the deviation that Rome took was of a greater degree and order than even the Donatists. And so, by the logic of that disciplinary action, to consistently apply that rule would have to knock them out too.
Well, and so what was the deviation on Rome's part there? Just so I'm
sure.
clear.
Okay. The point is, and you also mentioned part 4 was the nature of the church. And this is all tied up together. The idea was that there was from the Apostolic age until Constantine, there was a uniform teaching throughout the church that the church itself was, all members of the church had to be prohibited from manslaughter. So that would be anything from self-defense to capital punishment to abortion to killing in war. Not just as a Roman legion, as any soldier. You could theoretically have been a Sicarii or a Zealot Christian, theoretically, but that never transpired. And that was based off of primarily the interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:38 to 42, and also certain interpretations of Old Testament prophecy. And that was the consensus. In fact, even the Catholic philosopher Ed Feser admits that at that time that was the position. Now he doesn't get into the motivations for it.
Sure,
that's not the point of his book. But the point that I'm making is that was the universal. It was unthinkable for any Christian at any point to say, not even that it wasn't even unthinkable that you could be a Christian and a legionnaire, but you could A, be a Christian that sheds blood, or B, be a Christian that runs an empire. Those two ideas it would be like talking about feminism in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, but those are, but those, I think I think those kinds of prescriptions that you're citing are things that can change. That I don't think that really pertains to sort of this essential teaching that a rule of faith gets at, or that or that something that apostolic succession is trying to protect.
Well, you see, but what it does do is, now, as you mentioned already, the nature of the church. But it does fundamentally, radically change the nature of the church. And that, of course, you said was under the rubric of apostolic succession. I'm paraphrasing it right now, but Peter Brown wrote a biography of St. Augustine. And he said that, yeah. And he said in a part where he's converting to Christianity, he said that it was no longer the church of Cyprian, which was essentially the church of a persecuted minority that held to extremely high ethical standards, but it was the church of the imperium, meant to dominate and possess the world, rather than to sort of resist it through the light of Christ. And that's a fundamental transformation in the very nature and being of the church.
I would disagree with that. It's not a fundamental transformation in the nature and being of the church. It's a transformation in the particular incarnation of the church at that point in history. The church is still the essential nature of the church isn't how it was incarnated in 4th century Rome. This is the mystical body of Christ here on earth, guided by the Holy Spirit, and that's the fundamental nature of the church.
No, well, yeah, but I mean, like the visible nature. But let's put it this way: the rule of faith in the ante-Nicene period, we would both agree, would have included baptism.
Sure.
And baptism isn't one of those kinds of things that can change based on historical contingency, right?
Yeah,
baptism is one of those kinds of things that there's no amount of historical contingency that you could say, yes, we now can then change it because it's no longer relevant. No, it's permanent.
Well, and it was, and the reason why it's permanent is you have such a universal attestation to it in the scriptures, in the early church. It was the point of admission that baptism is what you did first, and what baptism did for you was the point. And so, yes, baptism was a universal practice.
A universal practice, but also a practice that could not be changed or repudiated with the passing of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But that's exactly the way that this teaching was viewed of non-resistance at the time it was propounded.
But when you're talking about, I mean, baptism and non-resistance are two totally separate issues. I mean, you're talking about baptism is the first step in salvation. I mean, that clears away sin and initiates you into the body of Christ. non-resistance is a different matter altogether.
Well, it is about who's in and who's out, right? There's those elements of discipline and praxis and behavior. Okay, let me give you a more mundane example than baptism, because that is so crucial to salvation. Fornication. The prohibition against fornication and the fact that penalties accrue to an individual who commits an act of fornication is just one of those things that was always taught and is never going to change based on later historical contingency.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
so in that sense, because it's more mundane than baptism. Baptism might not have been the best example. This doctrine was seen like that at the time.
Okay.
It was like fornication. I mean, the idea of lumping in murderers, fornicators, homicides, and idolaters show up all in the same paragraph so frequently that they're seen as, it's seen as a level with fornication or lying.
Okay.
And nobody's going to argue that no amount of explanation of the rule of faith is going to reveal that fornication, lying, and stealing are not that bad, or that there should be performed. Right? It's not even that they're not that bad, because when you have the Arles and Constantine, it's a crime not to desert from the army. So it's not only that it's okay to do it, it's you must do it, and if you don't do it, you'll be excommunicated. So it's actually the idea that one could say that, well, we must perform fornication because now it's okay is completely inconceivable.
Sure. And
there's no way that would happen. And in like manner, in those early centuries, when it was seen on that level, with fornication, lying, stealing, idolatry, there's just no way that they would have said, oh yeah, at some point that's going to definitely be revised and changed in the way, because it would be seen on the same level as fornication and lying.
Sure. I mean, those would be sort of moral, sort of practically human absolutes that it's just better not to do those things. I don't. No,
but what I mean is that the development of the rule of faith would not then. If somebody were to say they were using the rule of faith to then say that lying isn't actually wrong, and that we've further developed the teaching, you say, well, that clearly can't be the case.
Sure, of course.
Exactly. And so when a church says that manslaughter is not only all right but mandated, no, it can't be. It's just like saying that fornication is mandated or lying is mandated.
But the church never mandated manslaughter.
No. Well, if you were called to arms by your emperor, you had to serve, and if you deserted, you were thrown out.
Sure. I mean, those would be points of honor, and you've made a commitment, and I mean, those would just be sort of just basic sort of citizen virtues that if you make a commitment to the military and you desert, then that's there's a problem with that.
Well, no, there's no volunteering in the Roman army. It was conscription.
Okay.
You didn't volunteer. It wasn't like the United States where you can volunteer. It was conscription in the Roman army. And if the emperor called you up, you were called up. You didn't have much say in the matter. No, but see, here's the point. The nature of manslaughter as a sin or a crime in the church was seen as interchangeable with something like, as I said before, lying, stealing, fornication, or idolatry.
Sure. I mean, those would be
and so
violations of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, but again, manslaughter, as they understood it, included killing as a judge, executing a criminal, executing, well, it wouldn't be execution anymore, but killing somebody in a battle, or anything like that. And so the idea that you can't change with the rule of faith a fundamental moral precept of the church that is universally accepted. Well, that was a universally accepted moral precept of the church. And the exact opposite was then taught after the 4th century.
Well, I think the moral precept would be like not military service versus not service, but I mean, the moral precept is thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not commit adultery, and that was the same in the 1st century or the 6th century. Like those, I mean, the church never backed away from the Ten Commandments. Those were always a part of the church's teaching and, practice to the extent that we're, fallible humans.
No, well, let's make a distinction here. It's thou shalt not murder in the Old Testament, but no, it's not that. Yeah, sure, of course. Catholics would say murder is wrong, but here's the point: it's that it was stronger than thou shalt not murder. It was that thou shalt not kill in any context, and that was the universal moral teaching of the church.
Okay.
During those.
I think it's very hard to say that. Someone at some point may have, it would be, the burden of proof of saying that it was the universal moral teaching of the church in 150 AD that thou shalt not kill is more of a literalistic sort of interpretation of the Ten Commandments. You're not going to, I don't think you would universally find that. I think that would be very difficult to prove.
Well, it would be it wouldn't be the Ten Commandments they're using. It would be the Sermon on the Mount. But in the historical record, now I can read some of the church fathers from different periods and spaces over the empire to demonstrate this. But there is not a single extant piece of literature of any Christian prior to the 4th century anywhere saying that this was permissible or lawful. All extant literature on the material throughout the Roman Empire, Gaul, Egypt, Greece, Africa, Asia Minor, Italy, was this position, and it was consistent throughout the centuries. So this is not some one location or one time period. It's a universal, consistent teaching. I mean, how else could one demonstrate that? I mean, how do you demonstrate that apostolic succession was a universal teaching? You look at all the church fathers that wrote over the span of the Roman Empire, and you see that throughout the first 3 centuries, from Gaul to Egypt to North Africa to Greece, they all taught this, and you deduce from that they taught apostolic succession. By that same line of deduction, we can deduce this.
That, and so just summarize for me what the teaching that you're saying that is different.
Yeah, okay. The early Christian teaching was that any form of manslaughter, whether it was in self-defense or killing for the government as a soldier, or killing as a rebel, like say the Sicarii or the Zealots, who would be non-state actors to use our modern parlance, or an executioner in a civil capacity. All of those were prohibited if any Christian performed those deeds, they would be expelled from the church because they had forsaken the teaching of Christ. That was the statement. That's as short as I can make it. And the Catholic Church said, well, the Catholic Church hadn't divided yet in the 4th century, but in the 4th century, Christendom said, no, actually, killing in war is okay. Killing in self-defense is okay. Abortion is still wrong. Killing in as an executioner, you could actually be an executioner for the civil magistrate. Those things, you could be a Christian in good standing in the church and still have those careers.
Okay.
Whereas that would be absolutely impossible in the early church. I mean, it would be akin to having a Christian being in good standing and being a prostitute, or a Christian being in good standing and being a moneylender. I mean, that's exactly how they would have viewed it. And so those don't change based on time or contingency. And given that it's the same sort of moral precept, it won't change based on time or contingency either. Because if it could, then so could murder, rape, theft, lying. But they don't. If it's in that category of moral truths, then it doesn't change based on temporal contingency. It can't change.
Well, I think that you have a situation where allowances are being made for different times and different situations, and the moral principle is still being upheld. Thou shalt not kill. But if you're in a situation, if your job is an executioner, and I don't know how many Christian executioners there were, but the church was not teaching that it's okay to kill. There was never that. I mean, because I think the point that you're trying to make is that somehow, like, they've taught that it was okay to kill, and therefore apostolic succession is invalid.
No. The claim is not that apostolic succession is invalid. The claim is that Rome cannot have it.
But the church in Rome was not saying that it was okay to kill.
No. Well, okay to kill is a shorthand. What I mean is, it is lawful under the civil authorities to act in their name to use the sword.
Okay.
So let me make it as simple as possible. Romans 13, Paul says the state is ordained to use the sword. Now, in those early centuries, it was the consensus of the church that no Christian could be the one that would use the sword. What changed fundamentally and drastically in the 4th century was that, for the first time, Christians said that once the individual's been legitimately sanctioned, can use the sword in the name of the state.
Okay.
And that is a change that the Catholic Church taught. And well, before there was a Catholic Church, the church, Orthodox Catholic Church.
I mean, in terms of being a matter of dogma or a matter of faith and morals, I mean, you're talking about a position relative to the civil state. I mean, you have a position that changes relative to civil society. I mean, that has to happen.
Well, no, it doesn't. I mean, we could give the example. Let's say a Roman emperor converts to Christianity and wants to woo people in. The Christians could say, well, no. I mean, from the perspective of the early church, that would be as if a prostitute said she converted to Christianity and then wanted to open a brothel and then invite Christians in to run the brothel. Because now we have a Christian brothel head, it's okay to do it. That's how they would have seen it, and they would have said that's absurd.
Sure.
Because remember, why is this moral teaching temporally contingent, but none of the others are? I mean, why in your mind is this moral teaching that was uniformly taught throughout the church, is temporally contingent, but none of the others are, like murder, rape, theft, lying, stealing?
The teaching in question again is killing in the name of the state, or
like I said, all forms of manslaughter.
Forms of manslaughter.
All forms.
That it's. I don't think the church is ever excusing manslaughter, but
by manslaughter I mean the shedding of man's blood, however it's done, whether it's done in self-defense, whether it's done as a judge, whether it's done as a soldier.
Fair enough. If you're doing that, if that act happens as a part of a job that you hold within the state, that there is some allowance, or there is some tolerance for doing one's duty. Does it make the act okay? No. That person has an act, a sinful act that they need to repent of. But the church isn't saying it's okay to kill people.
No.
Or that it's okay to deliberately shed someone's blood. I mean, that's not...
I think there's a misunderstanding still going on here. It's not about the idea that it's okay. All Christians everywhere have understood that when somebody is killed, it's a tragedy, even if it's done justly, because we're all made in the image of God. The point is that it's not whether it's okay or not. Poor choice of words. The really is it lawful or not?
Well, okay. Is it lawful according to what? According to what law?
Well, that is the point. In those early centuries, there was no possible condition that could be met that would render such acts lawful.
Okay.
And then after Constantine, the church said there was a set of acts in which there was a lawful authority to perform such acts, and that is the change there of this universal moral teaching, which is it's turned on its head.
Yeah, I think that the universality of that moral teaching and the fact that I mean, you're essentially getting, I mean, the universal moral teaching is, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder in the Ten Commandments. That's the universal moral teaching. The fact that you had a different context and a different application of thou shalt not kill in 200 AD versus 400 AD doesn't invalidate the moral principle. It's just that you have an entirely different socio-political context in which to navigate that principle. And the church never said, this is where like apostolic succession is what you're trying to protect from a Catholic point of view is the deposit of faith. This faith that Jesus handed on to the apostles, and that the successors to the apostles handed on down to the present day. And whether there's, I don't think the example of one potentially universal moral teaching, and and again the burden of proof of to what extent that was universal, it would have to be crystal clear in every single church father that
wrote on it. Well, that wrote on it.
Or no, not that wrote on it. That I mean, if you're going to make the claim that it's universally the teaching, when there was so much diversity of teaching, it's very difficult to make a claim that a particular moral teaching was universally taught in the entire church.
Well, there's 2 points to be made here. Would you agree that not every early church father speaks on the topic of apostolic succession? Not everyone does, right?
Not everyone does, but there would be a consensus that there was this thing called apostolic succession.
Exactly, and this consensus is derived from reading the extant material, right?
Sure, and the fact that there was a consistent testimony that this is something that the church is supposed to.
Yes. So the consistent testimony and the univocal nature of the extant material.
Sure.
It's met the criteria head and shoulders. No, I could provide the criteria, though we're running near the end of the hour. Maybe it would be too late to do that. But yeah, I could very easily meet that criteria. But the other thing is, though, I don't find your objection very convincing, because then why would the Donatists get the boot for rejecting ex operato? That's far more trivial than rejecting a universal moral truth.
The Donatists got the boot because they put a greater onus on personal holiness than they put on God's grace. That was why the Donatists got the boot, and that was why Augustine took issue with what they were, because they were. I mean, it was a form of works righteousness, to use a more contemporary term.
Well, yeah, basically, what was at stake was it was after the Great Diocletian persecution. There were the people that had given the Bibles up to destruction, and the debate was how to let them back into the church. Should a high moral rigor be set up, or should in the case with I forget which pope it was, a more lax standard, and that was the debate. And the Donatists were, of course, ultimately militarily defeated, and then also subsumed by the Arabs, and then they get lost to history. But that's a moral teaching, and that was one moral deviation, but that was enough to get them booted out, right?
But it's not a moral teaching, because there was a theological principle that their moral teaching violated, because they put more of an onus on sort of perfect discipleship than they put on God's grace. And that was the reason that Donatus stands as a great hearsay ark.
Now, if you have, say, a law of God, right? A law of God as is given by God is fixed, and unless he changes, it can't be changed. Like, for instance, right, in the Old Testament, there was a sacrificial system, and it was changed because God changed it. But once God lays down a law, it can't be changed, correct? Unless some other date changes. Yeah.
Sure.
Exactly. This is where I think the misconception is coming from. The intuition that you're using about the 10 Commandments is not at all the intuition that's being used to invoke this rule. The intuition used to invoke this rule is the Sermon on the Mount, and the teachings of Christ, because Christ supersedes Moses.
Okay, fair enough.
And that's the justification that they're using. Now, the context of this statement is that the law of Christ teaches this. Now, I know you hypothetically, because I know you don't agree with this yet, maybe ever, but hypothetically, if that were to be the case, that this was Christ's lawful teaching of the law of faith for Christians, and then the church interpreted it that way for 3 centuries, uniformly throughout the empire, and then the church at some point said, "Now we're gonna change it," would that constitute a violation of apostolic succession and the rule of faith?
No, it wouldn't.
You don't think so?
It wouldn't, because you're taking one piece of the Sermon on the Mount and saying the church didn't do this right. The church didn't live this piece of the Sermon on the Mount right, post 320. Therefore, that invalidates apostolic succession.
No, not apostolic succession. The idea of it, but that one could lay claim to it. That's the whole point.
Well, a moral transgression on the part of the Pope or the part of the church or a bishop, doesn't invalidate their claim to it.
So you're saying that if a apostolic church were to at some point say that lying is okay, and they remove all penalties to lying, and they change the teachings of the church that penalize and teach against lying, and just say, no, actually, no, it's lawful under certain circumstances to lie, and that this, or even a more stark case, let's use prostitution, and they say that, okay, we're going to totally remove the prohibitions against it and say in certain cases it's lawful to do so. Could that church, having made such a fundamental change without looking back, lay claim to the succession lawfully?
It depends on your definitions of fundamental, but you're basically saying that, in the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm looking back at the Sermon on the Mount, which section of the Sermon on the Mount are we talking about here?
We're talking about Matthew 5, 38 to 42. Yeah.
$38 to $42. Sorry, I'm just bringing this up here just so we can talk apples with apples.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a passage where he's talking about an eye for an eye. If you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you that do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, then turn the other cheek also. So, that's about not returning violence for violence.
You mean, what you mean to say is it's not about personal vengeance, is what you're saying.
Well, it is about not acting out in revenge. That's what Matthew 38 to 42 is about. That's, not acting out in revenge. And the church has never taught that it's okay to act out in revenge.
No, of course not. Of course not. But here's the point.
But the church didn't universally teach at any point in its time that was okay.
No, but again, that's not what we're discussing. We're not discussing whether apostolic succession is real or not, and we're not discussing whether the church ever taught it was okay to kill people. What we're talking about is, can the Roman Catholic Church lawfully lay claim to apostolic succession? And two,
right.
the nature of a lawful use of force. So these are not what we're talking about.
Right, but you're claiming that at some point in time that Rome said it's okay to act out in revenge and manslaughter and shed blood, and I'm saying that the church did not. No.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, and I was very specific about 10 minutes ago when I said this, Rome, the imperial church said this, that there were lawful cases in which one could shed a man's blood. That was what I said.
Okay.
And that's not saying that it's okay to kill people just willy-nilly or even just because you like doing it. No. I was very clear. I said that in the beginning, there was no condition which one could lawfully shed blood, human blood. That was the statement. Now, secondly, we have next, in the 4th century, there are conditions when one can lawfully shed human blood. Now, that is what's in contention, not the 10 Commandments, not is it okay to kill people, not is apostolic succession real.
Okay, so the church is making different allowances for
go ahead, sir.
whether whether someone could act in self-defense.
No, but this isn't making an allowance. I mean, what if somebody were to say that fornication is lawful under certain conditions? You wouldn't call that making an allowance, would you?
Well, if I could imagine a case in which, someone holds a gun to your head and says, fornicate with this person, you could say no and take the bullet, or you could do it and dodge the bullet and live. And the church isn't going to say, well, it's okay that person, the fornication is still a sin.
No, of course. No, but here's the thing, though. There's still something that's not quite getting communicated here. The thing is this, that the church in the 4th century, there's a difference between doing something under duress that you know is wrong, but for whatever reason you feel the need to do it under duress. The difference is it wasn't even viewed as something wrong. That's the difference. The lawful, lawful coming from just war and the imperial authorities. It's not it's totally just analogous to what you just gave with the putting a gun to someone's head to fornicate, because that is under a unique situation under duress where the church might execute leniency. This is a ecclesiastical-wide policy that I'm talking about, which is what happened. An ecclesiastical-wide policy where the church unilaterally said that, all these cases that were formerly prohibited as a matter of course are now no longer prohibited as a matter of course. That would be akin to what I just said about prostitution, and that would be absurd. No church who said that could lay claim to any sort of Christian authority.
Sure.
And that is akin to that. It's not the same kind of sin, obviously. I mean, lying is different than assault, and assault is different than envy. But the thing is, though, it's not saying that it's okay and just get your you can just have fun doing it. It's saying that it's now permissible under certain circumstances as an ecclesiastical policy. Which, if were for any other of these moral offenses, you would immediately say, well, that's absurd. You can't say that as a church. I don't. It doesn't matter what church you are. You can't say that it's lawful under certain circumstances to commit fornication, or to lie, or to steal, or to be envious.
Well, now is this, you're talking about ecclesiastical policy, in terms of
imperial policy. Let me be more clear. Imperial policy.
Okay. Hold on. This gets into a big difference. You talk about imperial policy. Is this the policy of the emperor, or is this the Bishop of Rome in union with all of the bishops at the time? Because there's a difference between the imperium and the church.
Yeah, let me put it this way. Okay, we're talking about the Catholic position. Any Catholic which is in communion with the Bishop of Rome, living under any civil magistrate that happens to be, I mean, even Augustine argued that you should, I think, even praise the Christian soldiers under Julian the Apostate, because they did their duty to the emperor, even though the emperor was pagan. So the point is, though, is that any Christian who is in communion with Rome, living under any secular authority, they should and must answer the call if the country calls them to fight on its behalf, or if it chooses them to, or if you choose to take a career as, say, an executioner. Because, I mean, after all, if everybody's baptized as a Christian, then they're all Christian by default at that point in time. So then you'd have Christian executioners, because everybody in the country was a Christian at that point. Then that would be a valid career choice. Whereas saying that, prostitution or usury or being a moneylender, rather, that's the profession, or even an actor in some cases would be no, the church, you wouldn't say that those are lawful activities to engage in. So they said that these are lawful activities to engage in. You don't have to take that activity. I mean, if you get conscripted, well, then you better serve the emperor or the prince or whatever. But if you have a choice, you don't have to do it, but it's a lawful activity for you to engage in should you so desire to make that your profession. That's the specific. I'm trying to be specific here, very specific.
Sure.
And so, but you would agree, though, that if a church said that in any of these other cases, that these were lawful professions to engage in, then any claim, any pretense to being a Christian church would be very dubious at that point.
Well, in terms of because it's still, I'm not familiar with these sources that you're citing, so it's not clear to me whether you have, if this is civil policy or if this is like the new the question of dogma isn't, we're not talking about dogma here. We're talking about a moral teaching, or the church endorsing a moral teaching. We're potentially talking about the church endorsing a moral teaching or not. It's not clear to me whether this is because the church and the empire become integrated, and so where do you draw the line between what the state says and what the church says? That does become blurrier with Constantine, and so it's I want us to be really clear about what the church is saying and teaching, and what is being allowed to happen in this new Christian society that sort of got born overnight. And because clearly you have new policies being devised to respond to this new situation in the empire, in the church. You have a whole new situation to deal with. And it's one thing for the state to say, well, it's okay for Christians to do this now that the state is Christian. It's like, well, okay, there's an argument to be made there, I suppose. But that's different from, the Church of Christ saying, that, if you're a Christian executioner, or if you are that somehow just because it's your job that sanctions it. Or I don't think that because what we're talking about are how moral teachings are being applied and how moral teachings are being responded to in a particular context, I don't think that invalidates the Rome's claim to apostolic succession, or Rome's claim to anything. Because you don't have an example of the Church of Rome, the church in Constantinople, teaching, the church itself teaching that you're not talking about a change in doctrine or a change in, you have, in a sense, perhaps there is a change in the discipline, in the approach of the how the church is approaching these things. But in terms of Rome's ability to lay claim to apostolic succession, you still have a pope that's in union with the bishops, that's teaching, teaching in the same way that Jesus entrusted the apostles and Peter to teach. And so you have a consistency of that ministry. It's not exactly the same teaching coming out at exactly the same point, but you have a consistency of the presence of that ministry and a desire to preach the gospel and to stay faithful to the message and the mission that Jesus has for us.
Okay. We need to wrap up soon. It's nearing the hour mark. I guess this is the final statement. I want to ask you one final question, and then I'll let you have any final words if you want. Okay. Again, let's say, if, just answer this one question, if a church laying claim to apostolic succession were to teach, and then consistently teach for the next 1,000 odd years, that prostitution was a lawful mode of employment, and that one could be a Christian in good standing, in communion with that apostolic see, and be a pimp or a prostitute or any number of functions engaged in that trade lawfully as a career, would you say that a church has not fatally compromised itself?
Well, I feel like the example is sort of absurd, because of course the church is not going to teach that it's okay to be a prostitute. or they're not going to say, yeah, it's okay that you engage in this activity that's clearly contrary to God's law. So I feel like the example is sort of extreme and absurd in and of itself. Of course not. And I know you're trying to use this to illustrate how the church taught one thing before Constantine and something totally contrary in this one instance afterward. But in terms of the moral principle of yes, the discipline changed. There was a change in discipline. At one point, it was not okay to be a part of the military because of what the military was doing, and afterward, that became okay.
Okay.
So there is a change. I acknowledge that, but that does not invalidate apostolic succession in any way.
Do you have any concluding remarks before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about Rome's claim to apostolic succession, there is a consistency of teaching and a consistency of praxis that dates back to the earliest years in the church, and we have Peter, in the New Testament, bears witness to that, very clearly as being, sort of the prince of the apostles, and you see this this notion of apostolic succession carried forward in the patristic era, and probably the greatest proof text for the validity of Rome's claim early on is the fact that you have the same ministry of Peter in union with the bishops active today. If there's any claim to the validity of Rome's claim to apostolic succession in the 2nd century or the 4th century, it's the fact that in the 21st century that it's still active and alive. And I think that's, that obviously that wasn't, the crux of our conversation. There was a very clearly a specific example that I wasn't aware of that you had in mind, that you wanted to sort of demonstrate disproved apostolic succession, or Rome's claim to apostolic succession. But if Rome doesn't have valid apostolic succession, then who does? Perhaps the Orthodox Church? Where is valid apostolic succession if it's not in the Roman Catholic Church?
Was it a statement or a question? I think it was a closing statement, right?
It was a closing statement that ended with a question.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on, Craig. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.